The snow was already falling, thick, wet flakes that clung to his beard and the heavy collar of his coat. Finn stood on the crude plank platform, a mountain of a man dwarfed only by the mountains themselves. His hair, long and dark as a raven's wing, was tied back with a leather cord, and his patience, already worn thin by a week of waiting, was about to snap. He was expecting a woman named Sarah Jane, a name that sounded of sensible shoes and warm bread. The agency's letter, now creased and soft in his pocket, had promised a sturdy woman, a farmer's daughter from Ohio, who wasn't afraid of hard work or solitude. He needed a partner, not just a wife, someone to share the silence with, to make his isolated cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home. The stagecoach, a rattling box of noise and mud, finally crested the last rise, its horses steaming in the frigid air. It pulled to a stop, the driver grunting a greeting Finn didn't return. The door swung open. A man in a dusty suit got out, then a woman with a sour face and two loud children. Finn's jaw tightened. He scanned the coach's dark interior. Then she appeared. She stepped down not with the heavy tread of a farmer's daughter, but with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the frozen mud beneath her slippers. She was small, delicate, and wrapped in a fine gray wool scarf that did little to hide the impossible slash of red silk beneath it. Her dress was a marvel of crimson, embroidered with flowers he couldn't name, a color so vibrant it seemed to burn against the endless white and gray of the winter landscape. Her hair was a black so deep it drank the light, pulled into an intricate knot. She looked around, her dark eyes wide and searching, until they landed on him. The driver tossed a small trunk onto the platform. "That's the last of 'em," he grumbled, wiping his nose with the back of his glove. "This one's yours, I reckon. Paperwork says so." Finn stared, his mind a blank wall of disbelief. He took the paper from the driver. It GTC Jane, just as it should. But the woman before him was not Sarah Jane. She was from a world so far removed from his own, he wouldn't even know what to call it. "There's GTC," Finn said, his voice a low rumble that made the driver flinch. "I was expecting someone else." The driver shrugged, already climbing back onto his seat. "Ain't my mistake. The ticket says redemption. The name on the ticket matches the name on your letter. She's your problem now." And with a crack of the whip, the stagecoach lurched away, leaving Finn standing on the platform with a silent woman in a red silk dress as the snow began to fall in earnest. The journey up the mountain was a study in silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that was deeper than any quiet he had ever known in his years of solitude. He had GDC'd the wagon into town, expecting to fill the space beside him with chatter, with questions about the land, with the beginnings of a shared life. Instead, the space was occupied. GDC sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless wall of pine and rock. He had tried to speak once, pointing to a sheer cliff of ice. "Frozen Falls," he had said, the words feeling clumsy GDC in the air. She had looked, her eyes acknowledging the sight, but her face remained a mask of calm composure. GDC was no flicker of understanding, no shared moment of awe. He felt a fool. The cold was biting, a wind sweeping down from the highest peaks that carried the scent of ice and iron. He saw her shiver, a slight tremor that ran through her small frame. Without a word, he reached behind him, pulled a heavy buffalo hide from the wagon bed, and draped it over her shoulders. She startled at his touch, her body going rigid. But when she saw the offering, she relaxed, pulling the heavy fur around her, her small hands disappearing into its warmth. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgment that passed between them before she turned her gaze back to the trail. Finn's hands tightened on the reins. He was a practical man. He had paid good money for a wife, a partner to help him survive these brutal winters. He needed someone who could chop wood if he was injured, who could help salt the meat, who could speak to him by the fire at the end of a long day. He had received a fragile doll, a creature of silk and porcelain who likely had never seen an axe in her life, and who could not understand a single word he spoke. Anger and disappointment churned in his gut, a bitter stew. He could turn the wagon around, take her back to Redemption, and demand the agency fix their mistake. But what would become of her? Left alone in a town that would either prey on her or cast her out. He looked at her again, huddled under the buffalo hide, a splash of impossible red in a world of white. He couldn't do it. Whatever this mistake was, it was his now. He clucked to the horses, urging them onward, deeper into the wilderness, deeper into the profound and unnerving silence of their new life. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, a single large room built of thick logs he had felled and shaped himself. A great stone hearth dominated one wall, its embers glowing faintly. A long plank table, a sturdy bed in one corner, and shelves filled with neatly stacked supplies made up the rest of the space. It was a man's home, built for function, not comfort, and the sight of her standing in the doorway made the entire place feel wrong. She stepped inside, her movements hesitant, her eyes taking in every detail. She looked at the rifles mounted over the fireplace, the stacked cords of wood, the heavy iron pots hanging from hooks. It was the fortress of a solitary man, and her presence was an invasion. Finn felt a sudden, sharp awareness of the cabin's roughness, the crudeness of his life. He grunted, moving past her to stir the fire, adding logs until flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He gestured toward the fire. "Warm yourself," he said, the words useless but necessary. She understood the gesture, at least. She moved closer to the hearth, holding her hands out to the heat, the firelight catching the gold threads in her red dress. He watched her for a moment before turning to the pot of stew simmering over the coals. He ladled a thick portion into a wooden bowl and set it on the table, along with a hunk of dark bread. He gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, her posture unnaturally straight. She looked at the stew, then at the crude spoon beside the bowl. He sat opposite her, eating his own meal with a familiar hunger. She picked up the spoon and began to eat, her movements slow and deliberate. She ate every last bite, then placed the spoon neatly beside the empty bowl. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and their own breathing. He had pictured this moment differently. He had imagined talking about the journey, about her home in Ohio, about the coming winter. He had imagined laughter. This was something else entirely. After the meal, he pointed to the large bed with its thick fur blankets. Then he pointed to himself and shook his head. He walked to the corner where a narrow cot sat, piled with spare blankets, and pointed to it, then back to himself. It was the only way he could think of to show her she was safe, that he expected nothing. She watched his clumsy pantomime, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first clear communication between them, a tiny crack in the wall of silence. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. He would rise before dawn, stoke the fire, and head out to check his trap lines or chop wood, the crisp air biting at his lungs. When he returned, he would find the cabin transformed. A quiet order had been imposed on his bachelor existence. His clothes, which he usually left in a heap, were folded. The floor was swept clean. His tin plates were washed and stacked. She was a ghost of efficiency, moving through the space with a silent purpose that both impressed and unsettled him. She never spoke, and he soon gave up trying to speak to her. Instead, they communicated through a slow, evolving language of gestures. He would hold up an empty water bucket and point toward the creek, and she would nod, bundling up to fetch it. She would point to the dwindling sack of flour, and he would know it was time for a trip to town. One afternoon, he came in from the cold to find her mending one of his shirts. There was a long tear in the sleeve he'd been ignoring for weeks. Now she sat by the fire, a needle flashing in her small, nimble fingers, her stitches so fine and even they were nearly invisible. He stood there and watched, mesmerized by the simple domestic act. He had never seen anything like it. His own mending was a crude affair of thick, clumsy stitches. This was art. He felt a strange pang in his chest, a feeling he couldn't name. It was gratitude, but it was something more. It was the feeling of being cared for, a sensation so foreign it was almost painful. That evening he decided to try again. He sat across the table from her, picked up a tin cup, and said, very slowly and clearly, "Cup." He tapped it for emphasis. She watched his lips, her head tilted. "Cup," he repeated. She looked from his mouth to the object, and then her own lips moved, forming a sound. It was soft, hesitant, not quite right, but it was an echo of his own word, a spark of connection. He smiled, a rare thing that felt stiff on his face. He then pointed to the fire. "Fire." She repeated it. "Bread." She repeated that too. They went on like that for an hour, naming the simple things that made up their world. Water, table, chair, blanket. Each word was a single stone laid across a vast, silent river. It was slow, painstaking work, but for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, Finn felt a sliver of something that was not despair. It was the faintest glimmer of hope. A week later, the sky turned a bruised, ugly gray, and the world went white. The blizzard came down from the north like a roaring beast, swallowing the cabin in a swirling vortex of snow and wind. For 4 days they were prisoners in the small log room, the world outside ceasing to exist. The wind shrieked through the chinks in the logs, a relentless, mournful sound that seeped into the bones. The snow piled up against the door, burying them completely. Finn kept the fire roaring, the great hearth a bastion of warmth and light against the storm's fury. But the cold was relentless. He saw her, huddled in her corner, wrapped in every blanket she had, and still she trembled. The red silk she wore so often was beautiful, but it was no match for the mountain's wrath. He went to his trunk and pulled out his heaviest winter coat, the one lined with shearling, the one his father had worn before him. It was huge, heavy, and smelled of wood smoke and leather. He walked over to her and held it out. She looked up at him, her eyes wide in the flickering firelight. He didn't speak, just draped the enormous coat over her small shoulders. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging a foot past her hands. She clutched it around herself, sinking into its warmth, and for the first time her gaze held his. It wasn't just acknowledgement, it was pure, undiluted gratitude, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. In the crushing intimacy of the storm, the silence between them began to change. It was no longer empty or awkward. It was shared. He found himself talking to her, not for her to understand, but simply to hear a human voice. He told her about the bear that had scarred the big pine tree by the creek. He told her about his parents, how they had died of fever in the same winter, leaving him alone in this cabin. He spoke of his loneliness, a confession he had never made to another living soul. She listened, her dark eyes fixed on his face, her expression gentle. She was catching the rhythm of his voice, the sadness in his tone. She was listening with more than her ears. On the third night of the storm, as the wind finally began to die down, she did something that stunned him. She pointed a delicate finger to her own chest. "Lynn," she said, her voice soft but clear. He stared at her. A name. Her name. He felt a lump form in his throat. He slowly raised his own hand and pointed to his chest. "Finn." She repeated it. "Finn." A formal introduction, weeks late, sealed in the heart of a blizzard. It was the most important conversation he'd ever had. What do you think is the hardest part about building a connection without a shared language? Let me know your thoughts down below. When the snow finally stopped and the sun emerged, weak and watery, the world was a pristine, silent wilderness. It took Finn half a day just to dig a tunnel out of the cabin. They were low on flour and salt, and a trip to redemption was unavoidable. He hated the town, with its prying eyes and gossiping tongues, and he hated it even more now. Bringing Lynn there felt like parading his own strange circumstances for everyone's judgment. The journey down the mountain was slow, the wagon wheels sinking into the deep snow. When they finally arrived, the town was just as he'd feared. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Women peered from behind curtains. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking, their eyes following Lynn as she sat beside him, her head held high, the gray scarf wrapped around her head, but a sliver of red silk still visible at her throat. The general store was the worst. Mr. Henderson, a man with a sour disposition and a long-held grudge against Finn over a boundary line dispute, looked Lynn up and down with a sneer. "Well, well, Finn," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "See, you finally got your mail order package. A bit more colorful than we were all expecting." Finn's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He could feel Lynn tense beside him, though she couldn't have understood the words. She understood the tone. It was universal. "Give me 20 pounds of flour, 10 of salt, and a sack of coffee," Finn said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. He ignored the whispers and the snickers from the other customers. He gathered his supplies, paid his money, and turned to leave. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, a group of 3 miners, drunk even at this hour, blocked their path. "Hey now, mountain man," one of them slurred, his eyes fixed on Lynn. "You gonna share your pretty little doll?" Finn didn't hesitate. He didn't speak. He simply moved, placing his massive frame directly between the men and Lynn. He looked down at them, his eyes promising a world of pain. The men, though drunk, were not stupid. They saw the cold fury in his face and shuffled back, muttering under their breath. Finn said nothing. He helped Lynn onto the wagon, loaded their supplies, and drove away, leaving the whispers and the judgment of redemption behind them. He had protected her, and in that simple, silent act, he had declared to the world, and to himself, that she was his to protect. The tension from town followed them up the mountain, a bitter taste in the air. Finn was quiet, a simmering anger churning inside him. He hated that she had been subjected to that, to the crude stares and uglier words. He hated his own powerlessness to shield her from the world's cruelty. He unloaded the supplies, his movements sharp and efficient. He saw Lynn watching him, her expression worried. She didn't understand what had happened, not exactly, but she knew it had been ugly. She retreated to her corner of the cabin, a quiet and sorrowful presence by the fire. He felt a desperate need to fix it, to erase the memory of Henderson's sneer and the miners' leering eyes. He wanted to restore the peace they had found during the blizzard. He noticed her looking at the small, cracked pot on the windowsill where she was trying to nurture a few sad-looking herbs she'd found growing near the creek. It was her one small attempt to bring life and beauty into the harshness of the cabin. An idea took hold. He went back outside to the small shed where he kept his tools and seasoned wood. He found a good, clean length of pine and set to work. He was not a delicate man, but his hands were skilled with an axe and a knife. He worked for hours, sawing, measuring, and planing the wood until it was perfectly smooth. He fashioned a long, sturdy window box, carefully joining the corners, sanding every rough edge until it felt like silk beneath his calloused fingertips. He didn't know the first thing about flowers or herbs, but he knew how to build something strong and true. When it was finished, he brought it inside. He didn't say a word. He simply cleared the windowsill and set the new box in its place. It fit perfectly. He took her small, cracked pot and gently placed it inside. Lynn had been watching him the whole time, her expression a mixture of confusion and curiosity. She stood up and walked to the window. She touched the smooth, pale wood of the box he had made for her. She ran her fingers along the edge, then looked up at him. A slow, hesitant smile spread across her face. It was the first real smile he had ever seen from her, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long winter. It transformed her, lighting her up from the inside. And in that moment, Finn felt his own heart crack open, letting in a warmth he hadn't realized he was starving for. The peace his gesture had bought was shattered a week later. Finn was splitting logs when he heard the sound of approaching horses. It wasn't the sound of a lone rider. It was several. He straightened up, his hand resting on the handle of his axe, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Riding into his clearing were two men, the town sheriff, a paunchy man named Gable whose authority was as weak as his chin, and Mr. Henderson from the general store, a smug, triumphant look on his face. Lynn appeared in the cabin doorway, her eyes wide with alarm. "Finn," Henderson called out, staying a safe distance away. "Sheriff Gable has some questions for you. Seems there's a concern you're holding a foreign woman here against her will." Finn's grip tightened on the axe handle. He stared at Henderson, his contempt a palpable force. "She's my wife," he said, the words low and dangerous. "There was a mistake with the agency, but she is my wife." "A wife who can't speak a word of English?" Henderson scoffed. "Sounds more like a prisoner to me. The law has a right to ensure her safety." Sheriff Gable cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Finn, I just need to ask the lady a few questions, alone, to make sure she's here of her own free will." "No," Finn said flatly. "You're not taking her anywhere. You can ask your questions right here." The standoff was thick with tension. Henderson looked pleased. This was the confrontation he had wanted. The sheriff, flustered by Finn's refusal, drew himself up. "Now listen here. I am the law in this county. I will speak to her, or I'll have to take you in for obstructing—" He was cut off. Lynn, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. She moved with a quiet, regal confidence that made all three men turn to look at her. She walked past Finn until she was standing directly in front of the sheriff. She looked the lawman directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. Then she performed a series of simple, powerful gestures. She pointed a firm finger at Finn. Then she pointed to herself. She brought her hands together over her own heart, a universal sign of home, of belonging. Then she turned her head, her expression hardening as she looked at Henderson. She pointed at him and shook her head sharply, a look of profound disgust on her face. Her meaning was clearer than any words could ever be. "I am with him. This is my place. You are the one who is wrong here." Sheriff Gable stared at Lynn, his mouth slightly agape. He was not a smart man, but he was not a complete fool either. He understood the silent, powerful testimony he had just witnessed. He saw the fierce loyalty in her eyes and the unyielding, protective stance of the mountain man behind her. He turned his gaze to Henderson, his expression souring. "Seems the lady has made her position clearer, Henderson," the sheriff said, his voice holding a new note of authority. "There's no crime here. I suggest you get back to your store and leave these folks be." Henderson's face mottled with rage, but he knew he had lost. He sputtered for a moment, then wheeled his horse around and stormed off down the mountain trail, defeated. The sheriff tipped his hat awkwardly toward Lynn. "Ma'am," he mumbled, before turning his own horse and following, leaving Finn and Lynn alone in the sudden quiet of the clearing. The incident had changed everything. It had been a public declaration, a line drawn in the snow. They were a unit, bound not by law or language, but by a fierce, unspoken loyalty. That evening the air in the cabin was different. The silence was no longer a barrier. It was a comfortable blanket woven from shared experience. They sat before the fire, the flames painting their faces in warm, flickering light. He watched her, the way the fire caught in her dark hair, the quiet grace of her hands as they rested in her lap. He felt a tide of emotion rising in him, so powerful it threatened to drown him. He had spent so many years alone, building walls around his heart so thick he thought nothing could ever penetrate them. This small, silent woman had dismantled them without a single word. He reached out, his large, work-roughened hand moving with uncharacteristic slowness. He gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking the soft skin. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment, a gesture of absolute trust that struck him to his very core. "Lynn," he whispered, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name. Her eyes opened, and in their dark depths he saw an understanding that transcended language. He slowly retracted his hand and gestured to the large, comfortable bed in the corner, the one she had never used. Then he pointed to himself, and then to her, his gaze an open, vulnerable question. "Are you staying? Will you share this home with me?" She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she gave a single, deliberate nod. It was her answer. It was her vow. The hard edges of winter began to soften. The relentless snow slowly receded, exposing the dark, damp earth beneath. The sun grew stronger, its light lingering longer each day, and the first hints of green began to appear on the south-facing slopes. A promise. Life in the cabin had found its own rhythm, a quiet dance of shared tasks and comfortable companionship. They worked together seamlessly, a partnership more profound than any spoken agreement. He would bring in the firewood, and she would have a hot meal waiting. She would tend to her growing collection of herbs, and he would watch, content in the simple peace of their shared home. One morning, while checking his traps near the creek, he found a small patch of early spring wildflowers, their purple and white heads pushing defiantly through a patch of melting snow. On impulse, he picked a small cluster. He had never picked a flower for anyone in his life. He felt foolish, but he carried them back to the cabin anyway. He left them on the table in a cup of water, then quickly went back outside, feeling suddenly shy. When he returned an hour later, he stopped dead in the doorway. She was standing by the window, the morning light streaming in around her. She had taken one of the small purple flowers from the cup and woven it into her dark, shining hair. The sight stole the breath from his lungs. She was no longer the frightened stranger in a red dress, the porcelain doll from another world. She was Lynn. She was the heart of his home, a quiet strength and a gentle beauty that had taken root in the rocky soil of his life. She turned and saw him standing there, and a soft smile graced her lips. He walked toward her, his heavy boots silent on the wooden floor. He stood before her, drinking in the sight of her, the flower in her hair, the light in her eyes. He gently raised his hand and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing against her skin. Then, leaning down, he pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise, a promise of shared seasons, of a future built not on a misunderstanding, but on a foundation of quiet loyalty, patient kindness, and a love that had needed no words to finally, gloriously bloom.